morning. How's everyone doing? Good. I'm Jericho. I'm one of the pastors on staff. It is great to be with you here this morning. Last week, Stephen kicked us off with this new series that we've started this summer called Parables. A parable is just another name for a short story. And so Jesus tells all these short stories throughout the first 4 books of the New Testament. We're going to spend this summer learning about some of those stories. I love a good story. How many of you know somebody who can tell a story really, really well? Like when they tell the story, you want to listen. If somebody else told the story, maybe has all the same details and it ends the same way, but for some reason it just doesn't end with the same punch, or it doesn't have the same amount of impact. It doesn't evoke the same amount of emotions within you. There's some people who can tell stories really, really well, and then there's some people who just can't tell stories well at all. Like my 3-year-old, she cannot tell a story well. When my 3-year-old starts a story, she starts it like this. Mama, yesterday, yesterday, at church, at school, I have to go to the bathroom. That's how my 3-year-old starts a story. But then there's some people who can tell stories really well. And when they get up to toast at a wedding, or they start in on a story at a party, or you're just sitting around the living room with them, and they start telling a story about their childhood, you just know it's going to be good. There's some people who can, through storytelling, evoke all these emotions within us, whether it's joy or sadness or grief. And it's not this synthetic thing. It's not this fostered thing. They're truly able to make us feel that through this story. My grandpa could tell stories like that. My grandpa was this amazing storyteller. My grandpa Terry, when he could tell a story, he could talk about any hobby or any activity to anybody from any background, even if he knew nothing about the topic, and he was able to get away with it because he was able to find a way to relate to and to engage with somebody on a deeper level. We all know people who can tell stories like that. My grandpa, when I was in college, he was diagnosed with terminal melanoma. He's since passed, but when he was first diagnosed, he knew what he wanted to do with his last days. He decided that with his last days, he wanted somebody to record him, to film him, telling on camera, communicating on camera his favorite stories that he'd experienced throughout his life. My grandpa was a surfboard shaper, an artist, a craftsman by nature. And so to hear him artfully and an amazing way, illustrating way with his words, communicating the story of his life. I remember getting to see that played at his memorial. Hearing that and seeing that played, hearing my grandpa's words and seeing him share the story of his life and the story of how he believed in a good God, a God who is a creator, a God who is powerful. That was an amazing thing to hear. My grandpa communicating these life lessons and stories of meaning. It is an amazing thing that we have today, the very stories that Jesus told during his lifetime, written down, recorded for us to read today in the New Testament. Jesus was the master storyteller. People would come from all over to hear him teach and to hear him tell stories. Last week, Stephen shared with us this definition of the type of stories that Jesus told, which were called parables. Here's the definition of a parable. At its simplest, the parable is a metaphor or simile drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt to its precise application to tease the mind into active thought. The stories that Jesus told always left the listener wondering, what did Jesus really mean when he said that? Did he mean what I think he meant? Was there a different meaning in that? And it would cause and stir up all this conversation. And there was always a surprise ending or a twist to the story that people didn't expect. Today, we're going to learn about one of these parables, a story that Jesus told, and it comes from Matthew 20, 1 through 16. So if you have your Bible or a Bible app, you can go there. If not, I'm going to tell the story and read some of it so you can just listen along. It's Matthew 20, 1 through 16. Here's how the story that Jesus tells starts. In Matthew 20, verse 1, Jesus starts like this: "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard." Right from the start, we can see that Jesus is going to make a comparison about what the kingdom of heaven is like. He's going to tell a story to help his listeners understand a little bit more about what the kingdom of heaven is, to understand some of the characteristics of what the kingdom of heaven is like. And he's going to tell a story to illustrate that. The kingdom of heaven, simply put, is this. The kingdom of heaven is God's presence and it's God's will permeating every part of creation. This is what Jesus is going to talk about. He's going to tell a story about this, about the kingdom of heaven, how it's God's presence and it's God's will being a part of all of creation. You are a part of God's creation, and so God's kingdom is being made known and established within you, within the person sitting next to you. It's God's will and God's presence being made known throughout all of creation. So Jesus goes on in the story to say this in verse 2. He, the landowner, the vineyard owner, agreed to pay them, the workers who he'd hired first in the morning, a denarius for the day, and he sent them into his vineyard. The landowner agrees to pay the workers who he hired first in the morning a denarius, which is a fair full day's wage. That's what he tells them, and that's what he agrees with them. And he sends them out into the vineyard. Now, most theologians or scholars all agree that when Jesus was telling this story, he meant for the vineyard owner to be symbolic of God. So God is representative of this landowner, vineyard owner in this story. Jesus goes on telling this story, and he says that throughout the day, a couple hours later, after these first workers started working in his vineyard, the landowner goes back out into the marketplace and he sees more people standing around. He says, "What are you doing? Come work for me in my vineyard and I will pay you whatever is right." And then some more hours go on and he goes and finds more people who don't have a job. And he says, "Come work for me. Come work in my vineyard and I'll pay you whatever is right at the end of the day." The landowner, the vineyard owner, does this all day until 5 o'clock. And he still goes out and he hires more people at 5 o'clock. And he simply tells them, "I'll pay you whatever is right." But here's what happens at the end of the day when it's time for everyone to get paid. Jesus says this in the story in Matthew 20, 9 through 10. "The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon," so the workers who were hired last, who only worked a couple hours, "they came and each received a denarius, a fair full day's wage, even though they only worked a couple hours. So when those who came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius." Jesus goes on to say that in this story, the workers who were hired first are upset, and they, in their own right, should be. They started grumbling and complaining, and they were saying it was hot all day, and we worked hard all day, and we showed up first. It's hot outside right now. It's humid. And they started complaining and grumbling and said, "We deserve more. You paid these workers who showed up last at 5 and maybe only worked a couple hours the same as us. They're not equal to us." Jesus ends this story by saying that the landowner simply replies with, "I'm honoring my agreement with you. We agreed on a denarius, a fair full day's wage, and that's what I gave you. I have my own right to my own money, and how I have decided to pay everyone is equal regardless of the amount of time that they've worked." So let's step back for a second. Jesus is telling this story to his disciples. His disciples are 12 of his closest followers and friends. They're his faithful followers. Why is Jesus telling this story to the disciples? And what might we think that Jesus would have wanted the disciples to learn from this story? And for those of us who've grown up in church for a long time, sometimes when we read stories like this, we're quick to jump into not just the disciples, but we ask questions like, what might Jesus have wanted the religiously elite of Jesus' day to learn from this story? The religiously elite were called Pharisees. And sometimes for those of us who've been in church a long time, we talk about Pharisees and we talk about them, I think, in a really unfair way. We only give them this negative rap, this bad connotation, and we only point out how their faith became a lot more about rigidity and works. Pharisees were religious leaders in Judaism, and they prided themselves on living up to Jewish laws, and they wanted to hold everybody else to the same standard. And so it was easy for their faith to become a lot more about a works-based thing and less about transformative love for God by loving other people. And so when we read stories like this, we're quick to point out, see, Jesus is making a jab at the Pharisees. And he wants us to understand that he's drawing a comparison between the Pharisees and the vineyard workers who showed up first in the morning by comparing the two and saying that, well, that they just think that they're better than everyone else, that they deserve more. But Jesus isn't talking to the Pharisees. He's not telling this story to the Pharisees. He's telling it to the disciples. And while maybe Jesus intended there to be some similarity between the Pharisees and the vineyard workers who showed up first in the morning, I think it's actually far more likely that Jesus would have wanted the disciples to see themselves in this story and to learn for themselves what being in the kingdom of heaven was really like. So let's look at this story from our perspective today. When we just read it at face value, what are some of the things that jump out of us when we first read this? One of the things that jumped out at me is this parable. When we step back and look at it objectively, it actually is really offensive to the whole idea of American value of individualism. This Western mindset of, I'm a unique individual, I have rights, I matter, I deserve what I work for, what I get. Individualism is this idea that I am a unique individual and I matter, and my worth and my value can be tangibly measured. It's measured by how much my voice is heard or not heard. It's measured by the opportunities I'm given or not given. Now, individualism isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's really good things that come from it. It's individualism that backs our democracy and our right to vote. It's individualism that allows people to dream and work hard to achieve big, lofty goals in their life. Individualism, although it's our context, this American mindset is diverse, individualism likely impacts almost every single one of us, in that it's seeped into all the small things in life. For example, when you work, you go to your job to get a certain amount of pay because that's what your individual input has been for what you deserve. It's an agreed on amount, just like the workers in this parable. When I was in high school, I took this babysitting job for a mom, and she was going to be out of town. She had 2 little boys, and she told me she was going to be out of town just for one night. She told me, I'll pay you to stay for one night at my house to watch my boys $100. I said, great, awesome. So I stayed at her house for one night and watched her kids. And in the morning when she came back, she did pay me in $100, but she didn't pay me in a $100 bill or 20s or 10s or even 5s. She paid me in $52 bills. I don't know how she got $52 bills, why she had $52 bills, or why she thought that was a normal way to pay someone, but that's what she paid me in. It was the agreed on amount. It just wasn't what I expected. The vineyard workers who show up first in the morning, they get the agreed on amount. They're given what was agreed on. They're paid the right amount, but it's not what they expected any longer. And it's also no longer what they thought they even deserved. This whole idea of individualism, of fairness, of what's right, of what's deserved, is completely tossed out the window. Right when the disciples think that Jesus is about to say, and then the workers who showed up first in the morning got double the pay, Jesus doesn't say that. He takes a sharp turn and he goes in a completely different direction. That's what's so captivating about these stories that Jesus tells, because the point he's making isn't a point that people are expecting him to make, and it's often a point that is countercultural. Most of us in this overarching American Western individualistic mindset Ask the question in life, what can I get? For example, what can I get from this job? What can I get out of this subordinate? What can I get from this trade-in? What can my government give me? What can I get from this relationship or this friendship? How can I have my needs met? There's a different mindset, though, that belongs to cultures that come from group identity cultures. In group identity cultures, the first question, the lens that people look through in life isn't, what can I get? It's not that the self doesn't matter. Somebody's own individual self does matter. The individual matters. But instead of first thinking of one's own self-interest, people who identify with group identity cultures tend to think less about what can I get out of this, and instead, what obligations do I have to contribute to society? For example, how does my family benefit from me serving them in this way? How does the company I work for succeed rather than my own personal career goals? How can I be the best resident in my city? How can I contribute to my country to make it a place where everyone thrives, not just where I thrive? How can I treat the earth with care and respect? That's what it means to make this shift, to ask this question, not what can I get, but what obligations do I have to contribute? What do I have to give to this situation? I love this shift in perspective because I think it really gets at the heart of what it means to work in the vineyard. The vineyard workers who showed up at the beginning of the day, they only cared about the praise and the recognition that they thought they deserved from the work that they had done. And they wanted that praise and recognition in the form of payment. They cared about getting what they thought they'd deserved. Jesus tells us that this story of working in the vineyard is what it's actually like to be in the kingdom of heaven. And remember, the kingdom of heaven is all around you and I. It's within us. It's God's will and God's presence being established and permeating all of creation. And so when Jesus tells this story, he's saying this is what it's like to be in the kingdom of heaven. It's not about what you can earn and what you can get and what you deserve, but simply being in the kingdom of heaven, being a part of God's family, is about experiencing the good purpose God has for you in it. I want to explain what I mean by good purpose. Sometimes when bad things happen in life, when tragic things happen, when there's loss, when there's horrible things that happen, people, especially Christians, we try to grasp and hold on to a reason for how God could be doing something good out of all this bad, terrible, or ugly thing. We try and hold on to what's the good thing God is going to do to redeem this situation. How is God going to work good out of this? When a job is pulled out from underneath your feet that you've worked at for 20 years, or you have a cancer diagnosis, or a loved one does, or somebody's tragically passed away. In an attempt to grasp and hold on to what good God is going to do out of that thing, we'll say phrases and things like, well, God has a reason, and maybe we'll just ask God one day. Or God needed that person in heaven. That one always makes me feel a little cringy. Or God is going to do something good out of all this. Just wait and see. You'll see the good thing that God is going to do out of this. While well-intentioned, I've said things like that before. While well-intentioned, those words can often be hurtful and unhelpful. And here's why. Not every circumstance is going to be good, no matter how much we try to dress it up or make ourselves feel better. It's just not. And for those of us who've gone through real tragedy and real grief and real loss, you know that. You maybe haven't seen the good that's come from that thing that happened 20 years ago or that thing that happened last month. But we read verses like this in the Bible Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. We read verses like this and we say, see, here's the good thing God is going to do. God is going to redeem this situation. He's going to do something good out of it. Just wait and see. But we don't keep reading. And I don't think this is where the author Paul intended us to stop. Because right after, in verse 29, right after this verse, Paul, the author, goes on to say this: for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. The good thing that God is doing in all things is that God is conforming you into the image of his Son. In all things, good, terrible, beautiful, ugly things in life, the good thing God is doing is he's fashioning you more into the image of Jesus. That is the good purpose God is doing in all things. This is really important, so I want to put this up here. It's not the circumstance that God always makes good. It's you. You are the thing that God makes good. God can continue to foster goodness within you, regardless of what's going on around you. Our mission statement around here is this. You've probably heard it before. It's helping you experience grace and discover purpose. This story that Jesus tells is about grace and it's about purpose. Grace and purpose. Because the workers who show up early in the morning, they're upset that they don't get what they think they deserve anymore. And instead, they learn that the landowner, the vineyard owner, he's not really in the business of what's fair. He does the complete opposite of what they think is fair. The vineyard owner pays everyone equally. To do something gracious is to extend an unmerited gift, an undeserved gift. And that's exactly what the vineyard owner does. He gives an undeserved gift. It's about grace. The kingdom of heaven is like this vineyard where people show up at all different times. Some of us have showed up later, early on in life. And we've been learning for a long time what it looks like to emulate the characteristics of Jesus. Some of us show up later in life, and we might just be learning what it looks like to follow Jesus. Or we might just be learning for the very first time what it looks like to follow Jesus. I have good news for you. God is less concerned about the longevity of your faith. He's more concerned about the quality of your faith. The second part of our mission statement is purpose, discovering purpose. The vineyard workers who were hired first, they only cared about the payment that they thought they deserved, the payment that they could get out of the work that they had done. Sometimes we do this in our faith, especially for those of us who've been following God for a long time. I'm in a season where I'm learning this more than ever, where it is easy to get in a groove of serving and volunteering and reading your Bible and praying and going to church, and for me, even being on staff and working at a church and doing all these things for God, but not actually being with God. And so in those instances, it can become sometimes more about what we can get out of faith and less about what we can become from it. If that's us, if that's you, and you've just arrived and you're starting to really understand what it means to be in the kingdom of heaven, then I have good news for you too. God loves you and accepts you just as you are, regardless of how long it's taken to arrive. Just like the vineyard owners who show up late in the day, God loves you and accepts you just as you are. Being with God means every day we wake up and we say, God, please help me be fashioned more into the image of your Son, of Jesus, being conformed in the image of Jesus. That is the good purpose that God has for you and I. I love this quote from Rich Viotis. I think he really sums up just what it means to truly live out this good purpose. Here's what he says. At the end of it all, Jesus will not say, well done, good and successful servant, or well done, good and influential servant, or well done, good and high capacity servant, but well done, good and faithful servant. The good purpose God has for you and I is to become more like Jesus. It's not about how successful we are, how influential we are, how much we can load up onto our plate and on our schedule, how much we read our Bible, how much we go to church. All those things are important, but it's not about how much praise and recognition we think we deserve from others for how good of a job we've done, or doing all these things because we think that's what's expected, and that's what will get us into heaven, or that's what we think will earn us favor with God. If that's what we think, then we've missed the purpose. We've missed the good thing that God can do in us. The reason why I think this parable is so offensive to a lot of people, sometimes we just skim over it and we miss how offensive it really is. The reason why I think this parable is so offensive to just our own idea, our own individualistic mindset of what's fair, of what's right and deserved, is because it upsets our norm of what we expect. There's this fancy word called meritocracy, and meritocracy is this idea. I just learned what this word is. It's a system of ruling over others based on merit, based on skill, ability, education, talent. And so this scholar named Brian Zand, he just beautifully sums up what we can learn from this parable, and it's not about what we deserve or earn, it's about grace. Here's what Brian says. The kingdom of heaven is not a meritocracy. The kingdom of heaven is an economy of grace. This parable teaches us that God's kingdom is about extending grace. Grace was so central and it was so core to how Jesus lived that it led him to die on a cross. Jesus died for the sake of extending grace to you and I. Death does not have the final say. Jesus has the final say. And so as we close, I want us to return to this idea of our mission statement, of extending grace, of extending God's grace, of maybe experiencing God's grace for the first time, and also discovering the good purpose that God has for us. I want to end by helping us process through that by asking these two questions. These are the two questions. The first one is, what trait or lesson is God currently teaching you? Maybe it's patience. Maybe it's trust. Maybe it's experiencing God's grace or extending God's grace. The vineyard workers who showed up early in the day, they learned that the landowner didn't discredit those who showed up later in the day simply because they'd worked less time. And so maybe God is teaching you humility, or simply to care more about what God thinks and less about what other people think about you and the praise and recognition that you think you deserve from others. The workers who showed up late in the day were welcomed and received exactly as they were and given the same payment, this undeserved grace. And so if that's you and you're maybe just starting to learn what it means to follow Jesus or learning about Jesus for the very first time, you need to know that there is a God like this vineyard owner who loves you and accepts you exactly as you are, regardless of your past. Maybe for people like myself who've been following Jesus for a while and you've been learning to live out what it looks like to follow Jesus, to emulate the characteristics of Jesus. Faith can sometimes become a lot more about what we can get out of it and less about what we can become from it. And like I said, it's easy to get in that groove of doing all these things for God, but not actually being with God. For those of us like that, sometimes we're quick to jump to identifying with the workers who show up first in the morning. But I think we're actually far more like the workers who show up late in the day. Because if that's you, if you identify that way, we've completely missed the point. It's not about doing all these things for God and having faith for what we can get out of it. We've missed the purpose. But just like the workers who showed up late in the day, there's a God who loves you and accepts you exactly as you are, even if you're finally just really starting to get it. This second question here, what part of your heart are you keeping from God? We're going to sing this song in a minute, and I want to read to you some of the lyrics of this song. He's not moved by perfection. God is not moved by perfection or how well you look the part, but he's wild about the hidden stuff, like he's wild about the heart. God is wild about your heart. And you are a part of God's loved creation. And so as a part of God's loved creation, what part of your heart is still not experiencing God's grace and God's purpose? What part of your heart do you still need to surrender to this good God? I want to encourage you to not let this be the end of the conversation. If you want to pull out your phone and text yourself these questions, take a picture, write them down, think about someone in your life, whether it's your partner, it's a grown child, a friend, a family member that you trust, a neighbor, and talk about your answers to these questions. Process through what God is teaching you. Maybe how God is teaching you to truly live and just sit in his grace, his undeserved grace. Or how God is teaching you to extend his grace to others and how that might look in the different circumstances in your life with the different people you interact with. Process through how God is leading you to experience his purpose and how that can take root in your heart. How God is making you good despite what's going on around you.